point about Witkoff is he's sitting on multiple fronts being an envoy. Iran, Israel, Gaza, Russia. The guy's not a qualified diplomat. He's not a qualified negotiator. And that's the risk here, is that the Kremlin spin him and Trump backs off. He does not talk. He does not walk the walk. And I'll add one more thing. The Kremlin has a window right here if they can get that done, because the U.S. Congress is out of session. Remember, when Trump put in the threat to put sanctions and tariffs on Russia, it replaced the threat from the U.S. Senate for 500% sanctions or tariffs on Russia and its partners. Because the Senate said, okay, if Trump's threatening to do this, we can't overtake him, we'll wait. They don't come back into session until next month. So the Kremlin's tactic here is they buy themselves a few weeks.
Hi, I'm Jo Crawford and welcome to Times Radio's Trump Report. Today I'm joined by Scott Lucas, Professor of US Politics at the University College Dublin's Clinton Institute and also founder and editor of EA WorldView. Thank you for joining me on the Trump Report today.
Hey, happy bank holiday weekend, at least here in Ireland. It's great to spend it with you.
Well, I'm very jealous of your bank holiday, but I want to talk about what happened 2 days ago when Trump announced that he had ordered 2 nuclear submarines to be positioned in the appropriate regions following what the president called highly provocative statements by the former president of Russia. I mean, what do we know so far about this?
Okay. I mean, it's important to go through this incident because, we're talking about, oh my gosh, is it nuclear confrontation between the U.S. and Russia amidst the Russian invasion of Ukraine? So you sort of have to dial into what happened and these men in particular. You start with Dmitry Medvedev, former president of Russia, now deputy head of the State Security Council. Dmitry likes to go on his social media almost as much as Donald Trump does, and he likes to talk trash, which is the term that we use in American sports. And it's like, we're going to get you. Don't you threaten us. We're Russia. We're brilliant. And he was going after Trump because of Trump had put this 50-day deadline on Russia to ceasefire or face tariffs and secondary sanctions. And Trump had said, they're still not ceasing fire. They're still attacking Ukraine civilians. I don't like this. I'm going to shorten the ceasefire to maybe 12 days, maybe 10. Dmitry goes on to social media and fires off this tweet that says, don't you fire these ultimatum at us. We can get you, right? Okay, this is going into a weekend. Now, what we know about Donald Trump is, and we've known it with tariff announcements, we've known it when he fired the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics on Friday, is that when Trump gets on Friday, he gets bored, he gets frustrated, or he just wants to get attention before he goes down to Mar-a-Lago in Florida. And so he goes on Twitter, Truth Social. And in this case, he goes on to Truth Social and goes, I'm sending these nuclear submarines out for the coast of Russia because this Mr. Medvedev, he said something mean, and we'll show him. Donald Trump does this. Okay, Trump did this. And I remember this, and I was kind of surprised more of the media didn't. You remember back in 2017, went first term with North Korea, and that little rocket man came around, we're going to get fire and fury on them. I'm going to turn this aircraft carrier force around in the Pacific, and I'm going to sail them towards North Korea, right? And in fact, there was not a big redeployment of American forces in North Korea. Trump was just firing this off. In the same way here, it's important to distinguish between U.S. nuclear-powered submarines, which have conventional weapons, and U.S. submarines with nuclear weapons. Now, U.S. nuclear-powered submarines with conventional weapons are off the coast of Russia. That's a standard deployment because you're watching the Russians. It's all part of the maritime positioning that goes on. Both countries do it. And what officials let the media know is, we do this anyway. Nothing has really changed here. But Trump, it would be different if the U.S. had submarines with nuclear weapons that were deployed. That would be big. That would be huge. But Trump, of course, was very ambiguous about this. And in fact, I'm not sure Trump knows the difference, because the interesting thing about this nuclear weapons issue, I think everybody probably knows by now, because Trump tells everybody that he had an uncle who was at MIT, a pretty smart guy, right? He was at MIT, a scientist. And because this guy was at MIT, Trump says, I'm a genius as well. I'm a scientific genius. I know everything there is about nuclear weapons. So he's posturing, right? And doing all this. And the US system has to bring this down a level. And meanwhile, what we have to calculate, which is more serious, is whether Dmitry Medvedev was actually just a little bit three sheets to the wind when he put his tweet out, or whether that's part of a Kremlin strategy and tactics, which takes us to the really important issue, which is Russia going to continue to put the pressure on Ukraine, or is it going to step back because of the potential that not just Donald Trump, but the US system is finally going to toughen up on the sanctions and possibly on tariffs?
It's interesting how Trump had he's claiming that this is in direction to what Dmitry had said. How much do you think this was also towards Putin as well? We've got that deadline counting down, that 10-day deadline that Trump had imposed onto Putin to agree to a ceasefire with Ukraine or face sanctions, tariffs. How much do you think that is directed towards Putin as additional pressure there?
Well, I think the starting point is Trump was aiming it back at Medvedev. I mean, it's just reminding me. I'm sure you've never been in this position, Joe, because you wouldn't put yourself in this position. But you've been in a pub and you get two guys who are like wannabe bullies who front up to each other. Oh, I'm tougher than you are. No, I'm tougher than you are. I'm tougher than you are. And sometimes they wind up fighting each other, and sometimes they both like slip away into a slumber in the corner of the pub. So that's what happened here initially. But again, I can read Trump on this. The tricky part here is whether Medvedev was in effect speaking for Putin when this took place, and whether Trump took it that way, right? Now, I do think Trump, on the wider story, is clearly frustrated with Putin. He clearly thought that Putin was going to give him the photo opportunity, the deal with Ukraine, the Nobel Peace Prize, war is over. You know, the whole thing, I'll stop it in 24 hours. Trump thought that back in February when the Kremlin played the US into getting direct talks because Ukraine and Europe weren't at the table. But then the Kremlin overplayed its hand, not with Trump, but with others in the administration. And they didn't give any type of move, any type of token compromise. And so we get to March, we get to April, we get through the spring, we're in the summer. And instead of moving towards the deal, they're still firing hundreds of drones and missiles every night, murdering civilians each and every night. I just had to upgrade on the latest casualties. And thumping their chest and saying, we're going to take even more Ukrainian territory. So there's no realistic possibility of a deal. And so Trump, I think, although he aims at Medvedev, it's in the wider context of, he's like, where's my Nobel Peace Prize? Why is this not happening? But again, you just circle back to it. That's sort of Trump talking the talk, oh, y'all better do something. And the question here is he going to walk the walk? Because that deadline, which was supposedly going to be September the 2nd, and if we could just examine it for a minute, let me just adjust my ring light. It's annoying me. That was going to be 100% tariffs or secondary sanctions, not only on Russia, but on its main trading partners. That's the Chinese, that's the Indians, are the top two. Now, that would be huge if that went through. And we're all watching to see if it happens. And of course, Trump gets so frustrated, he says, I'm bringing the deadline forward to sometime in August. Well, we're now at the point, you and I are counting the days, that deadline should be coming up end of the week or start of next week. And we're thinking, is it going to drop? But here's the twist in the tale. As we put all these things together, the Kremlin, to play Trump and to keep spinning this, because they don't want those sanctions. And they are very worried about the sanctions. And we can talk about the economic situation Russia's in if you wish, is they're going to invite Steve Witkoff, the real estate developer and purported envoy, to Moscow at the end of this week, right? So they're going to take Witkoff out there and they're going to say nice things to Mr. Witkoff, because Mr. Witkoff, every time he goes out to Russia, comes back and repeats the Kremlin's lines. He supports their ultimatum that Ukraine should give up territory. that sanctions should be lifted on Russia, that there should be a neutral and weakened Ukraine. He repeats all their lines. And so they're going to bring Witkoff back out there and hope we'll get Witkoff to go back and he'll talk to Trump and it'll take the pressure off. Now, they've got a basis for thinking this will work. Because again, a quick reminder to viewers and listeners why we're watching this. The last time the real estate developer and purported envoy Steve Witkoff was in Moscow. I don't know if you remember this, Joe. He goes in there and Vlad comes in and says, "Hi, how you doing, Steve? How's it going? How's that real estate development doing?" And Witkoff comes in and there's the foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, and there's Putin's top economic guy, financial guy, Kirill Dmitriev, and there's no one with Witkoff. There's no U.S. official there with Witkoff. And he goes up to the table and he looks at a woman on his side of the table and goes, "Who are you? Are you from the embassy? Are you my translator?" U.S. Embassy didn't even send a translator with him. He doesn't even realize what's happening. And what had happened is the Kremlin had put their own translator into that meeting. That lack of preparation and that lack of skill on the basis of Witkoff is why the Kremlin think they can spin him again. And the other thing is why they think they can spin him is Witkoff is everywhere right now. He's sitting right now, as I talk to you right now, I think he's still trying to get the non-existent solution to Israel's mass killing on Gaza, now talking about a comprehensive plan, which is effectively a long-term Israeli occupation of Gaza, having just done a PR visit to Israeli aid facilities, which is in the context of almost 1,000 Gazans killed trying to get that aid. Anyway, different topic. Point about Witkoff is he's sitting on multiple fronts being an envoy. Iran, Israel, Gaza, Russia. The guy's not a qualified diplomat. He's not a qualified negotiator. And that's the risk here, is that the Kremlin spin him and Trump backs off. He does not talk. He does not walk the walk. And I'll add one more thing. The Kremlin has a window right here if they can get that done because the U.S. Congress is out of session. Remember, when Trump put in the threat to put sanctions and tariffs on Russia, it replaced the threat from the U.S. Senate for 500% sanctions or tariffs on Russia and its partners. Because the Senate said, okay, if Trump's threatening to do this, we can't overtake him, we'll wait. They don't come back into session until next month. So the Kremlin's tactic here is they buy themselves a few weeks.
You said he talks the talk, but will he walk the walk? And we've got that acronym TACO, Trump always chickens out. Do you think that's going to be the case here this time with this deadline that's approaching? But as you mentioned as well, Trump's stance towards Putin has changed. He has become more publicly angry and annoyed at Putin. He said that he accused Putin of talking bullshit the other day.
I think Trump is angry. Trump's frustrated. Trump wants this all to be solved just like that. And of course, the issue is it's not going to be solved just like that. First and foremost, because the Russians aren't giving way on their demands. The most that he'll get is that the Russians might agree to go back into another round of talks with Ukraine, but not at the level of Zelensky Putin, which is what Kyiv wants. So that's the most he's going to get. And then the question is, does he step back at that point? I think that depends not only on Trump, it also depends, to put it on a more logical basis, not necessarily rational. It depends on who has Trump's ear, right? Because let's remind ourselves, we sort of tipped it off when we talked about Witkoff. You've got a divided administration here. You've got Witkoff, who supports the Kremlin's line. J.D. Vance has been very supportive of the Russian line, during this administration. But Vance has gone to ground a bit. He's been on vacation, and he's also being used to push Trump's big, not so beautiful bill, which is doing not so beautifully in terms of its reception by the public. So Vance has kind of been tied with that. So he's kind of gone silent on this issue. Meanwhile, you think, all right, Keith Kellogg, the envoy to Ukraine, very much supporting, Ukraine's position that it has to be able to defend itself. You're talking now about the Pentagon itself, which has resumed the supplies of military assistance to Ukraine. You talk about elements in the State Department who are working with the Europeans to try to put this assistance on a sound basis. Which faction prevails with Trump, right? You can't just put on secondary sanctions overnight. You have to prepare them in detail. You have to prepare them in terms of the economic implementation. You have to prepare them in terms of the legal implementation. How far has the U.S. Treasury gone with preparing those sanctions that Trump has talked about? Are they ready to go overnight if the order is issued? I think that'll be a tip off. I think if someone finds out if those sanctions are actually not only been talked about, if they're in preparation and those orders have been drawn up, yeah, that shows you that if not Trump, that if Trump says, let's do it, the US system is prepared. And if the US system is prepared to do it, remember, it then boosts those senators. And remember, 85 of 100 senators have backed the bill for sanctions. It boosts the sentiment on the Hill, which is, yeah, we have to do this. And you finally get an American position, which is a tougher position economically, militarily, and politically, working alongside the Europeans and working alongside Kyiv.
But that's what I was interested in. I want to know how this could potentially impact the EU, because they are one of, if not the biggest purchaser or consumer of Russian energy, aren't they? And if these secondary tariffs do get imposed onto Russia and those who are purchasing Russian energy, what could this mean for the EU?
Yeah, but this takes us to another story which is really interesting. I know, and I know I'm making you connect the dots here. And now I'm going to connect it with the framework. It's not a deal, but the framework between Trump and the EU for the 15% U.S. tariffs. Now, there are two clauses in that document which the EU got, which are really important for Ukraine. The first is, to respond to your immediate point, is they made a pledge to Trump. And Trump loves this, of course. He says, oh, okay, they're going to buy $750 billion of energy products, $250 billion a year, oil, natural gas, nuclear fuel. Now, there's no way, as some specialists have pointed out, that the EU is going to take $250 billion a year from the United States. I mean, there's just not enough demand here to take all of that, and the US may not be able to supply that much capacity. Why is that clause there? Because the EU wants to get rid of all Russian oil supplies by 2027, right? So to do that, they get alternate supplies, including from the United States. Look, while having to give way to the 15% tariff level, at least if this deal is confirmed, they now get those U.S. energy supplies coming in. So the EU is sitting there and planning for precisely that scenario that you're talking about. There's a second provision as well, which is the EU says we will invest $600 billion in the U.S. defense industry, which also makes Trump happy because it's money, money, money for America. Well, that's part of the EU ramping up its defense production and investment, in part to support Ukraine and in part as a broader EU security plan. Ursula von der Leyen announced it earlier this year. And so now, having thought just a few weeks ago, well, we can't get U.S. military assistance for Ukraine. We don't know if we could get the U.S. to back us in terms of our economic position on Ukraine. Now the EU makes these maneuvers on another front to lock in the Trump administration. And that tariff deal still has to be confirmed, and there's a lot of road there. But you can see the EU they are planning for this scenario. I think in the short term here, they've also built up enough supply at this point. In particular, they gave the reassurance. Again, here's another signal. 2 weeks ago, I think it was, they wanted to pass their 18th sanctions package. Very, very important package. For one thing, it cuts the price cap on Russian oil from $60 to $45 a barrel. Now, the two countries that were holding out were Hungary and Slovakia. Why were they holding out? We don't want you to completely cut the Russian oil supply to us. So we're going to hold up the sanctions package. Talks are held. Slovakia, Hungary withdraw their bloc because they get assurances you will still get your oil. You'll get it from Russia if there's an emergency situation, but we're planning to get it to you anyway. And so again, the EU, we can criticize it at times for being bureaucratic, slow, frustrating, but I think they're playing a good hand here in linking up multiple crises and how they deal with them. And in this case, you link up Trump, sanctions, tariffs, Ukraine security.
But in terms of practicality and the speed at which, for example, if these tariffs are applied onto the EU for purchasing oil off of Russia, but also in terms of, when we had that deal with the US of purchasing $750 million or billion in energy from the US to the EU. It will take time. And so there is a question there of how quick that will take, especially if they want to reach that 2027 deadline.
Yeah, but you're cushioned right now, and you have that time for a couple of reasons, Joe. One is because the EU has reduced its energy dependence on Russia substantially, especially the Germans. And I don't have the exact percent here, but it is way down where it would be in 2022. Secondly, if you look beyond oil and gas producers, we're actually in a period right now where there's a fairly plentiful supply. I mean, because of course you've got Gulf states who are producing, you've got shale oil, which is coming in off of North America from the US and Canada. You've got alternatives for gas, which is there. And the tip off here is that the oil price, the global oil price, despite the prospect of sanctions and tariffs, hasn't spiked up. If anything, the oil price has remained relatively level for the past couple of years. So we're not back to a 2022 situation. When you're in the UK, you remember what happened to energy prices, and you remember the questions about energy supplies. So I think the planning has been done where, yeah, if this was a protracted issue where you had to depend on Russian oil for a series of months or whatever, yeah, it would cut into there. But I don't think that that's the case. I think actually, Joe, to take it a step further, I think the question here is the ramifications on relations with China and with India that go beyond this, right? Because if the secondary sanctions come in, I mean, the Chinese and India are going to be told, you've got to stop your exports and your imports from Russia, or we're going to hit you significantly. And that doesn't just apply to the exports that support Russia's military. That's across the board. So how do the Chinese respond? Would the Chinese make economic threats or with economic steps? Now, they have in the past 24 hours, 48 hours, they have threatened to reduce the supply of vital rare earth minerals to the US, right? Including to the American defense sector. But I think that's connected more with the tariff talks. Now, connect the dots. If the US-China tariff talks don't go well and these sanctions are imposed, there could be a tricky patch in terms of relations with China, especially because the EU's talks with China did not go well last week. They were hoping for a breakthrough on the economic front, political front didn't happen. India is an interesting position because I think the Indians are well furious with the Americans right now. They're furious they didn't get a trade deal with America and Trump hit them with sanctions. But whereas the Indians, I think, are not going to be happy with the Americans, who just signed a trade deal with India, ding, 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 that's the UK. So in fact, what I think you see here is if we play this out, is if the American sanctions go on, the Chinese are going to reevaluate their position in multiple ways. India is going to look to diversify its economic links. And to bring this all the way around is if these American sanctions are put on China and India, what the EU and European countries and in the UK have to do is they have to be smart in how they deal with China and India to give them the more positive side of, look, you've been sanctioned because of your trade with Russia. You've got alternatives here. Let's examine what these alternatives are.
Scott Lucas, thank you so much for joining me on the Trump Report today.
Thank you, Joe. Stay safe, stay sane.